Hello, my name is Jess from the Scottish Highlands Centre. I am, as of today, the new co-host of the podcast, and I'm here today with the lovely Dylan,
Hello.
who I'm going to ask some questions to. So, this is for World Storytelling Day, and since I am new to Scotland, I'm originally from Belgium, I thought I would ask Dylan about some Scottish stories. First of all, we are on Loch Tay, which is a huge body of water.
Yes.
And as you drove me from Edinburgh Airport,
Mm-hmm.
I saw some statues of some massive horses.
Yeah.
On a scale of yes to very,
Mm-hmm.
how worried should I be about kelpies?
Very worried.
Okay.
They're very slippery. They are very cunning. They essentially, what they're kind of known for is tricking people into riding on them, and then they will run into the water and drown them. Why they do this, I'm not 100% certain, but it is something that they are definitely known for. But when you think about why might we tell a story like that? Why might we tell a story like that? It's a really interesting kind of thing to think about. Where do myths come from? Where do legends and folktales and things come from? And when you think about things like that, why you might be warning, for instance, a child. I mean, it makes a good story. It's very entertaining. But when you think about why might you, it's a bit like the bogeyman. Why might you scare a child into like maybe not just getting on a random stranger's horse, or it might
Approaching an animal maybe that isn't theirs or that they don't know.
yeah, and even approaching a body of water, it might kind of
that's a
make
good
people
point.
feel kind of encourage children or young people to think, oh well, maybe I'll be a little bit more sensible and things. So when you think about these, and again, like the it doesn't necessarily have to have a use or an explanation that's grounded in reality. It just it's an interesting story. It's an interesting folk tale, and I think this is something that there are so many of these little things that are all around Scotland that and particularly in this area. So when we think about Loch Tay and Highland Perthshire, Bredelban, there's a really rich sort of folk tradition, and a lot of these sorts of stories now we generally tend to find them as recordings rather than written records. So at least some of the more up-to-date folk tales tend to be on things like if you're ever looking for kind of a good source of folk tales of Scottish history as told in a folk kind of oral tradition. Things like the School of Scottish Studies sort of sound archive is a really good place to start. You can search up for different areas, locations. You can even look up informants, so people who have been in several interviews. So it's a really good kind of gateway. Sort of there are all of these sort of online archive materials that are really useful for. And I think more sort of close to when we think about people telling stories in the Iron Age, obviously no written word, no written record. The best way to get these sorts of things are from word of mouth. Everything is told orally in the Iron Age. So when we think
things
about
down.
yeah, exactly. And when we think about folk tradition nowadays, it's sort of confined to books. But I think a really good place to start is listening to these audio recordings, which can be quite old. We're looking into some of these recordings in the Scottish Studies archives were recorded on wax cylinder in the 1800s.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah, so it goes back quite a long way, and it's a really fantastic way. And a lot of the informants are kind of so-called tradition bearers. These are people who are well known within their communities for sharing information, sharing folk tradition and folk tales. And for instance, when we think about Kelpies, the story of the Kelpie, it would have come from sort of the only reason we have that story is because it was passed on, because at some point there probably was an informant, whether it was as formal as that, because a lot of the time in particularly sort of antiquarian works, there is no like clearly distinguished. You've got your collector and your informant. It's generally slightly more blurred than that. So but at some point someone had to tell this story, or probably various different people told various different versions, because this is another thing we find with folktales is geographically and throughout time folktales are repurposed and they are reinterpreted, and bits are added, people take away from them, and it's really interesting. It's really important as well to think of these traditions as being even though they're beginning to sort of wane away and dwindle now, particularly oral folk tradition is beginning to kind of, I don't want to say die, because it's definitely not dying. There is still a really vivid folk telling or folk tale tradition in Scotland. But certainly I think predominantly the way that a lot of people interact with these sorts of tales are online. They are, or not online, sorry, in books, or certainly online. You might watch videos, or it's generally through visual media rather than sort of listening to people telling these stories, and that's a really important part of these sorts of these folk traditions.
And do you find that the people who are sort of keeping these folk traditions, these oral storytelling traditions alive, is that an older crowd, or is that becoming a bit more of a younger group? Like, what have you personally seen?
A lot of so for instance, if you go on to Tobler and Dulcish, which is or Kister Riches, it's a good there's a lot of information on there about informants, about tradition bearers and collectors and things like that. A lot of them tend to be older, and a lot of these collections were made a while ago. So these kinds of archives are, not that they're not being updated anymore, but they're not being collected in exactly the same way as they used to be. So a lot of the informants that you find on these recordings or in archive material are probably passed away already. They probably aren't alive anymore. But when we think of, or just thinking about modern kind of trends, a lot of younger people are becoming more interested in these stories. They realise that maybe there is something being lost and something they do want to preserve. And whether this is in Gaelic or in Scots or in English, there are a lot of younger storytellers and even a lot of folk musicians who are telling the same stories that were told for centuries before them. Younger folk musicians, younger folk tellers or folk storytellers, I think it is beginning to become more of an interest, particularly with social media. A lot of in young people as well on social media, like TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and things, and a lot of particularly with Gaelic language stuff, but also you find it a lot with Scots language stuff. Younger people who are making content for these sort of platforms about folk tradition, folk song, these languages that exist in Scotland that are beginning to kind of fall out of use. But I think as well, it's important to stress that it's still vibrant, and it's sort of evidenced by the fact that it's or the fact that there are so many young people who are engaging with it points to the fact that there is a willingness to make it vibrant again and to bring these kind of stories to life and things like that. And I like to think I do that a little bit as well, doing like the storytelling here, the Cranog. And
what is podcasting?
No,
we're being filmed this time.
Well, yeah, exactly.
It's an archive for us. We're keeping this information, these different voices of people who maybe work here or are just passing through. We're recording them and we're putting them somewhere safe. In a way, and we are telling different stories.
Exactly.
For those of us who don't know, myself included, what is the difference between Scots and Gaelic?
So, this really comes from, well, the main difference is that they are from two entirely different language families.
Okay.
So the Gaelic language would have its ancestors, or its ancestor, sort of Middle Irish or Old Irish, originated obviously in Ireland.
Right.
And then you have settlers in the early medieval period moving into the west coast of Scotland who are coming from Ireland to bring with them the Irish language. And then eventually the Irish language develops and evolves in, obviously, of course, in this two geographical spaces. They evolve in slightly different ways, to the point that nowadays we have Scots Gaelic and we have Irish Gaelic. And this is where Scots Gaelic comes from. That's where it's distinct from English, in that English is a Germanic language,
right?
And Scots being a sort of, so again, it's going into when these languages separate. So at some point, Old English splits into Middle English and Scots.
Right.
So it's at that point you have this break in the language, and so in the Lowlands and in the east, or in the sort of south and east of Scotland, whereas generally Scotland is spoken in those areas. Scots is spoken in those areas of Scotland. So, and as well, it's important to stress that even though we are dealing with sort of two distinct, quite dissimilar languages, so
Right.
Scots has a lot of similarity to English, Scots Gaelic has a lot of similarity with Irish Gaelic. There is still a lot of interaction with the traditions and the tales, and obviously politically there are lots of entanglements between the Scots and the Gaels. So they do represent two slightly different cultural traditions, but obviously they both have a large part to play equally in the cultural life of Scotland. But traditionally, because the seats of power in Scotland have been in the south, Scots has been politically and academically more of an important language than Gaelic has. But Gaelic language has played an awfully big part, particularly in terms of recording things from these areas where Gaelic is spoken. And particularly in Perthshire. So this is a kind of good example, is that in the 1960s, a lot of people in Perthshire still spoke Gaelic, but nowadays it's very few people do. But if you look at the place names around Scotland, so at the time when we are looking at the Gaels arriving in Scotland, you have not quite got Scots yet, but we do have a Brythonic language. So this is a Celtic language, and sort of maybe term it autochthonous rather than indigenous to the island of Britain, and Pictish would have been spoken quite a lot in this part of Scotland. So we talk about the Picts in Pictland, they spoke Pictish, which we believe, we've got strong evidence that points towards it being a Celtic language. But despite this, Gaelic becomes the dominant language across this part of Scotland, Pictland, and at this point we're calling it Alba. So this is the Gaelic word that's still used for Scotland is Alba. But despite the sort of Brythonic roots, we do still have, so for instance, the Aber and Aberfeldy, the Pit and Pitlochry, these are good sort of pieces of evidence for Pictish language in the area that we still find in place names. But the vast majority of place names, and place names are really useful for thinking about the linguistic makeup of communities because they tend to stay very similarly shaped to the way they were in their original languages. But what we find in particularly Highland Perthshire is that the vast majority of these place names are in Gaelic. So this is quite interesting when we think about how you've got this sort of almost border area constantly in Perthshire, because we have the Gaels and the Picts beginning to mix together, and then we've got the Gaels and the Scots beginning to mix together. So you have all these sorts of traditions intersecting and beginning to mix, and it's really quite interesting. And again, when we think about tradition, now the way we use the word tradition, the way that we think about that term, it's more... It tends to kind of have this connotation of looking backwards and of staying in the past or bringing something from the past and bringing it up to now. When really, when we talk about traditions, they are things that are live and moving and constantly changing. They're very dynamic things. And I think the only reason that we now associate this idea of something being traditional as being something backwards or part of the past is because a lot of these traditions we are severed from. So it is sort of partially about reaching back and bringing those up to the present, and that by no means means that we are going backwards. It means that we're updating something, that we are reusing it, we're bringing this sort of dynamism back to it. And I think that's the really exciting thing about looking at particularly folk tales and stories and songs and things like that that are a part of or told through minority languages and things like that.
So do we know, because obviously we speak, or people here speak Gaelic still, and Scots as well?
Yeah.
Pictish, do we know what that would sound like?
We don't, unfortunately, because the Picts didn't leave us behind any written evidence. So it's not to say that they didn't have writing. We're fairly certain that they probably did, and we do find some, and in Perthshire as well, in the museum in Perth, there is evidence of Pictish stones with Ogham inscriptions. So Ogham is, again, it's a Gaelic script. So you use the edge of a stone or the edge of a rock, and you put
the little lines, isn't it?
So you carve these little kind of grooves, and depending on how you carve them, you get a kind of different letters. But as far as I'm aware, it's not been translated. So we think it does represent Pictish writing, but we can't translate it because we don't have anything to refer it to.
Yeah.
So that's the unfortunate thing, is that it would have been, or it is, as I say, as a Brythonic language, its closest living relative is probably the Welsh language. So it wouldn't have sounded or looked much like Welsh, but definitely a lot of those elements are there. So particularly, so I'm from West Lothian, and it's not a Pictish, so we wouldn't call the language being spoken in West Lothian in the early Middle Ages as being Pictish. We'd probably refer to it as Cumbric, which is, again, its closest living relative is the Welsh language. A lot of place names down there are very closely connected to the Welsh side of things rather than the Scots or the Gaelic. So, for instance, Lothian itself, that word Lothian, comes from the name of a Brythonic kingdom called Gododin. And where I grew up in a place called Broxburn in West Lothian, Broxburn, its other name is Strathbrock. And Strathbrock is a very Brythonic name, essentially. It comes directly from that Cumbric dialect. So, and I think this is the thing that's really important to remember, is that culture and language and tradition, folktales, the stories that we tell, just, I was talking a moment ago about this sort of dynamism. They're alive and they're constantly moving and shifting and changing. Scotland hasn't been Scotland forever. It's been constantly this mix of cultures and languages and storytelling traditions. And when we talk about Scotland in the early medieval period, so this is slightly a bit after the Iron Age when we're looking at the Cranach, but obviously it still has a relevance to how we look at the stories that we have in Scotland today. When we look at the early medieval period, a lot of the time, or a term that's become popular amongst scholars at the moment, is the Northern Mosaic. So this is the idea that we have Scandinavians in the north, that we have Gaels in the west and in the centre of Scotland. We've got the Picts who are speaking this Brythonic language. We've got the Scots who are speaking this Germanic language, similar to the Norse settlers, the Scandinavians, the north of Scotland. So we have this mix of Scots and Gaelic and Brythonic and Celtic. All of these influences are all mixing together. And an interesting sort of illustration of this is that, on the on the Outer Hebrides, and I think particularly the Isle of Lewis, I think 90%, something around there, of the place names on the Isle of Lewis are Norse in origin.
Oh, right.
That have just been sort of Gallicized. So you end up with this again. And then even the Gaelic name for the Hebrides, or the Outer Hebrides, is Inchigal, which means the Isles of the Foreigners. So where we think of as the Gaelic heartlands today, when they were named, and again, it kind of speaks to how durable place names are, is that even though the Hebrides aren't the foreign isles to the Gaels who are settled there and have been settled there for a very, very long time, that place name still endures. So it's an interesting, again, it's just an important thing to bear in mind, is that traditions are not static, and boundaries, languages, cultures, religions, these things aren't static. They are constantly moving. So when we talk about folktales, when we read folktales in children's books, in particular, these are a really good source of folktales, and they've been repurposed. And it's a good illustration of the fact that when we have and a lot of folktales, or a lot of collections of folktales, are geared to children. And again, this is part of this sort of constant moving, constant changing and reinterpretation. But I think it's a shame that adults aren't necessarily encouraged to interact with folktales, unless there's some kind of like dark element, or it's ghosts, or the weird sort of things. I think that's where we get folktales being marketed more towards adults and children. But I think everyone can enjoy a folktale. I think it's really important that everyone enjoys a folktale.
They don't go out of style, do they? They're like fairy
No.
tales. We update them, and we make them more relevant. We make the lessons that they tell different or more current. But I think the core of the story remains fairly similar all throughout. And you see that in different cultures as well, and that time as well. All these stories have very similar origins or a very similar moral. Which brings me to another good point or question that I had.
Yeah.
So, context for our viewers. We sometimes do a puppet show at the end of our tour. This is part of the oral tradition. It's also really fun for grown-ups and kids. And in this puppet show, there is a little girl who has to go on a mission from her Cranach. And on the way, she meets all these characters. And one of the characters she meets is a fairy called Inez. who has seen better days. And the puppet, she's a little scruffy
She's
at the
starting
moment.
to, yeah.
She's got some leaves in her hair, and we've all been there. And Inez says that she is from the fairy mountain Schiehallion.
Yes.
How close are we to Schiehallion? What kind of fairies are we talking about with Schiehallion? Will they sleep in a flower, or will they push me down a well?
Well.
What kind of fairies are we dealing with here in Scotland?
So, Schiehallion is not very far away from us. It's about maybe less than a 20-minute drive from the
Oh, it's just down the corner.
Yeah, and it's a really significant mountain simply because it is shaped almost, it's very regular,
Pointy,
it's
isn't
very pointed, yeah. And so Schiehallion, that element in the place name She, you'll find this all around Scotland. It is a really common place name, which is applied to places that fairies are alleged to dwell, alleged to live, or are sort of gateways, or gateways is probably the wrong, it's a very modern term, gateway, portal, these sorts of things, but a point of access to the fairy otherworld. Fairies in folk tradition can be good or bad. Generally, they are quite tricky. They like to cause a bit of trouble.
Mischievous.
So the fairies in Schiehallion probably more likely to push you down a well than anything else.
That's what I figured.
But we're not thinking about, a lot of the time when we talk about fairies, fairy means something very different in an English-speaking tradition than it does in a Gaelic-speaking tradition. Mainly because when we think about she, that she element in Schiehallion, it can have a kind of double meaning in Gaelic. So shioch would be the word for quiet or calm. And this kind of comes from this association with the fairies as being quiet or associated with calmness, is that you don't see them do what they do. You only see the effects of what they do. And we're not thinking, again, sort of fae, very pretty with nice long hair, and we're not thinking Tinkerbell. We're thinking people who look more like us, who are almost identical to human beings, but we just can't see them. And again, fairy is the sort of name that's stuck for these creatures. There are some sort of earlier kind of folklore collectors who would refer to them as elves rather than fairies.
Oh, okay.
So they are, again, and you find all over Scotland, as I say, and in Ireland as well. She is a big, so if you think banshee.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, banshee, that's she in that word. That
comes from...
So banshee, really, it means we associate it with these sort of screaming ghosts, which, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where that connection comes from myself. But banshee, so ban, again, in Gaelic or Irish, means woman. So banshee just means woman of the she. It means woman of the other world, essentially. Yeah, so this is Schiehallion, again, this is the big kind of... And when we talk about Gaelic tradition as well, there are a lot of links with Ireland, and that's something that as well we could stress, is that even when we look at crannogs, and the way that crannogs are very... there are an awful lot of them, a lot more in Ireland than we find in Scotland, and they're probably travelling this idea of building a crannog, probably spread through Scotland in a very similar way to the way that Gaelic culture spread through Scotland. And at this point, 2,500 years ago, the Celtic languages aren't quite as distinct. The different, so I've referred to Goidelic as opposed to Brythonic.
Yeah.
So Goidelic comes from the island of Ireland, Brythonic comes from the island of Britain. At this point, 2,500 years ago, the distinctions aren't quite as marked. But when we think about the language that the people in the Crannog would have spoken, so obviously we don't have their stories, we don't have their words, but the language these people would have spoken is probably a distant ancestor, again, of the Welsh language. Its closest living relative is probably Welsh. But again, at this point, Goidelic and Brythonic, it's not... It's one of these murky things. It's historical linguistics. It's a bit of a mire.
You've got to work backwards, haven't you, from what you've got now?
Yeah.
To build up a picture of,
it gets quite difficult to know exactly what's going on. And there's an awful lot written on the spread of Celtic languages and where these dislocations happened. But again, it's one of these things. It's a bit murky. It's a bit unsure, and our understanding of it is constantly changing. So again, even in that kind of aspect, the way that we understand the past and the languages that they spoke, even that's constantly shifting and changing and moving. So I think all of this is really, it's an interesting way of thinking about, and it's particularly relevant to us when we talk about storytelling traditions of the past, and when we think about fairies or she or Gaelic culture and the way it spread through Scotland, all the way into the crannog building tradition. These connections have always been there. These changing dynamic traditions have always been there. You've always got this mixing of cultures, mixing of traditions and languages and ideas. Most importantly, is these ideas and these stories. And yeah, it's an interesting point to think about. Yeah.
So I also have to ask about the most iconic story, I think, to come out of Scotland. The Loch Ness Monster.
Oh yes.
Nessie herself.
Nessie.
Thoughts, feelings. Who is she? How is she?
Oh.
Where is she?
Well,
is she in Loch Tay?
No.
Okay.
But if you believe some people, there are all of these subterranean tunnel waterways and things like that she moves around in. I don't know. Is there a Jurassic creature living down in Loch Ness? Who am I to say? I think it's, again, whether it's true or not, whether there is a creature down there or not, I think it's a wonderful story.
It ties in very much for me to the idea of kelpies, of there being something that you have to be like a little bit aware of, a little bit in awe of, in the water.
Yeah.
I think is sort of the unifying element there, which it is dangerous. Loch Tay is cold. It's real cold, especially right now.
Yeah.
You would not want to fall into that unprepared.
Absolutely not.
It's deep as well. You wouldn't want to go out there in a leaky boat. You wouldn't want to go, again, unprepared.
Yeah,
you wouldn't
exactly.
want your kids unsupervised running around there. And I have the feeling I've seen something about a Loch Ness monster being mentioned in a medieval text, or a saint who banishes the Loch Ness monster. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I've not heard of that, no. I will admit that Loch Ness monster is not on my radar at all.
She's not on your mind.
No, I think I've kind of freed myself. As a kid, very concerned about the Loch Ness monster and what she might do to me. I think, I got past that fear. But it's an interesting idea. It's definitely, I love the story. I think it's fantastic. A good way of, and it certainly, again, it's a tradition in itself, because tourists like to come and look for the Loch Ness monster.
Absolutely.
Stories about it being sighted, and stories connected to like the pictures and the images and things, and people trying to recreate them, and hoaxes and stuff like that, and whether it's fake or not. I think, to me, it doesn't matter. It's just, it makes a good story.
It's a good story at its core. And I think the fact that it is a bit mysterious, like you said with the she, you don't always see them, but you see what they've done. There is that element of mystery, that element of the unknown. I think people really enjoy that. And that allows us to fill in the gaps narratively as well. We can build up our stories from that. I also heard someone say that they saw a funny light over Fernan. Over Fernan the other day. So Fernan is a very, very old little village. It has allegedly the oldest yew tree in Britain there. And someone mentioned they saw a funny light there. Is that a traditional story? Should I be worried about aliens as well as kelpies?
I'm not sure about aliens.
And the Loch Ness monster.
Well, something that might concern you is that there is a lot of similarity between alien abduction stories and fairy abduction stories. So take that as you will. No, should you be concerned about lights over Fortingall? Probably not too concerned. I think that these lights that are seen over Fortingall, they've been seen for quite a while. And there is again, you can listen to the recording of the woman telling the story. It is on Tobin Dulcish, I think, or the School of Scottish Studies Sound Archive. It's on one of the places. If you look up local stories around Loch Tay, North Perthshire, you'll probably find it, about a fireball appearing over Castle Mingus, which is it's a little bit further
It's down the road
along.
that direction
Yeah,
from us
but
right now.
these sorts of things. So
Yeah.
again, we might be seeing the same sort of phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So this strange light that was it was one of our colleagues spotted it above her
House,
cottage.
yeah.
Whether it was the same phenomenon, and we just have different. So obviously now we do talk about aliens a lot.
Rather than the shield fairies.
Yeah.
We've taken that narrative and we've updated it. Like
Yeah.
you said, we've taken that tradition.
So I think that
And
the word
we've
that
adapted it.
I think the word that the woman in the story uses, or in the recording uses, is like ghost ball or something like that, a ball of ghost light or something. So you use what you've got to hand to explain unexplainable phenomena like
So
that.
nowadays we might say, oh, ball lightning or a meteor shower.
Yeah.
Whereas back in the day you might
Comet.
have said a comet, yeah. Or you might have said, oh, it's swamp gas, or it's the will o' the wisps.
Yeah.
Or it's something mysterious, it's a fairy light or something.
Yeah. So it's a good kind of, and I think I'm really glad you brought that up because I think, again, it's a good way to see how tradition can evolve and change and how people might be witnessing the same phenomena and just coming to slightly different conclusions based on, I'm not saying that our colleague that thought it was a UFO or anything like that, but how, you know, explanations, these sorts of things, it's not just tradition that can be passed on and it can be dynamic, it's also natural or unexplainable phenomena can kind of change and be reinterpreted and all of that. So yeah.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you so much, Dylan.
Thank you for having me. This has been my favourite podcast so far. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm not saying we should replace Rich, but you've been a fantastic co-host.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will try and link the resources that Dylan has mentioned in the description. And this has been a podcast recording for World Storytelling Day.
Listen a little, if you like, to a tale concerning a beloved troop of old, a lay of Grania, of Finn the bold, and Diarmid, the tragic son of Divna. Some of you may know of our hero, Finn MacCool, strong and brave, or of his fearsome men, the Fian, his band of hardy warriors. Some of you may know of his beloved, fairest and wisest Grania, the finest amongst all folk of Scotland and Ireland. A woman of such beauty and renown would surely be the object of many a lover's pining, but fairest Grania was sworn to Finn, and Finn only. Such was the cause of Diarmid's anger, for he loved Grania with all his heart. Imagine his frustration to see her betrothed to his mortal enemy. Finn was no stranger to Diarmid's desires, and though it bothered him little, soon enough he devised a way to put an end to Diarmid's pining. It was in Glen Shee, where sweet is the voice of the deer and the blackbirds, where often were Finn and his men hunting with their hounds. They knew that up on the mountain slumbered a great evil boar, with tusks the size of sabres, a coat of thick pointed bristles that could pierce any boot. No weapon amongst folk could pierce the skin of this feared beast, none but that possessed by Finn, his great spear, the Guy Bulliga. Finn sent a messenger to Diarmid to tell him of his plan, to wake the beast and slay it, whichever of them killed the beast would then have the heart of Grania. Diarmid's men sensed a trap, and begged him not to go. But Diarmid, son of Divna, shrugged, and picked up his mighty spear. Happily he went to the glen, spear in hand, just as Finn and his men roused the mighty boar, and Glen Shee echoed with its mighty roar. Finn's men stood guard as Diarmid ran to meet the boar, and he thrust the spear towards the beast, but no luck. It shattered in three, each fragment of metal shattering to the floor. It was now that Finn pressed forward, his hounds barking and the boar roaring. He picked up his spear, the Guy Bulliga, and tossed it to the boar. Once it struck the wild pig, it let out a screech and fell to the floor. Finn retrieved his spear, carefully so as to avoid its razor-like bristles. So, Diarmid, she said, it looks like I have won the heart of Grania, my betrothed, but I will offer you one more chance. Diarmid replied, You have killed this boar, and so have earned the affection of Grania. Why offer me another chance? Because you are a fine warrior with a fair heart, and as my enemy it pains me to admit this, but if you take my challenge, I will gladly give her to you. Diarmaid was unsure and suspect. It was most unusual for Finn to double down after he had already won his prize. "What is this challenge?" asked Diarmaid. "I want you to guess the size of this beast, from its snout to its hooves. If your guess is correct, you shall have Grania." Carefully, Diarmaid inspected the pig, examining its fearsome nose, estimating and calculating before giving his answer. "It is 10 feet, from its snout to its hooves." Finn smiled and said, "Go measure it then. Stand on its back and walk the distance, and see if it makes up 10 paces." Diarmaid could see his beloved Grania stood on the hillside, resplendent in the afternoon sun, but as clearly as he saw her, he could not see Finn's deception. Gladly, he stepped onto the boar's back, and immediately the bristles beneath his feet pierced through the bottom of his boot and into the sole of his foot. He fell from the boar's back, holding onto his leg in pain. Finn laughed and began to walk away. Now, Diarmaid could see Finn's deceit clearly. His treachery was plain. It had always been Finn's intention that he should stand atop the slain beast's back and fall like a child in pain, in plain sight of Grania. "I believe the challenge is now completed," Finn boasted. "Grania is mine, and you are done here." As he turned to walk away, quickly from the hillside came Grania, a symbol of radiance, though it was not love nor purity she radiated, but anger at Finn's deceitful behaviour. "I do not believe," she cried to both her suitors, "that either of you have deigned to ask me what it is that I want. There is no need for these childish battles so long as I have a will. There is no need for a boy's cry while I have a voice. So here is a challenge of my own for those who'd have my heart. Whichever of you can guess how many barbed bristles stand on this boar's back shall have my love." Finn and Diarmaid looked at one another, confused by Grania's sudden interference. "Are you sure that this is what you want?" asked Finn, surprised at his betrothed's unusual request. "Indeed it is," replied Grania. Diarmaid bowed his head towards her. "So it shall be." These two mortal enemies, Finn and Diarmaid, stood and stared, calculated and counted, but neither could think of an answer they found satisfying. Finn eventually approached Grania and said, "My love, there is no way that we could ever guess how many bristles there are. It is just like asking us to count the stars in the sky." "My loves, if you cannot guess, then count. The first to give me the true number shall win my love." "But dearest," replied Diarmaid, "we cannot count them without plucking them from the boar. Otherwise we will count the same bristles twice, and surely we will miss others." Grania smiled. "My mind is set. Only a man capable of counting the bristles is worthy of winning my heart. Pluck them if you must." Diarmaid and Finn quickly set to work, but each bristle was so thickly barbed that to pluck any was akin to dragging your fingertips over the blades of knives. Diarmaid and Finn stood all day wondering how to remove every bristle without drawing more blood. Their fingers throbbed and their brains ached. Still, the heroes could not figure out how to remove the bristles. They cut through every glove and no knife blade could blunt them. They tried counting as they had done before but quickly lost count, or confused the numbers in their heads and had to start again. Grania observed from the hillside. The sun fell in the sky and the shadows in the glen grew longer until it sank beneath the mountains and night fell. As the light faded, the heroes could not even see the bristles that they struggled with. They turned to call Grania on her hillside, but she was no longer there. For how long she was gone, they could not say. But in her place, they could see a pair of glowing red eyes moving through the dark towards them. And as the creature emerged into the moonlight, it revealed its tusks as big as trees, and the bristles as long as spears. The two heroes paled in the face of this, their latest challenge. They turned to one another and shook hands. Before the giant beast, the mother of the young boar they had killed, had a chance to let out its booming roar, they scarpered off into the night, the mother boar hot on their trails. Back home, tucked up in bed, was by the fire in her roundhouse, was Grania. She spared a thought for her eager lovers when she heard their dire shrieking before blowing out the candle by her bedside and drifting to sleep. And so this scene is closed, and so the tale of rivalry continues, as Finn the Bold and his troop of old, and in their wake the son of Duvna the tragic Diarmid, vie for fair Grania's golden heart.